Um, Welcome to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation brought to you by the Congress for the New Urbanism. Today we are going to talk about Downcity, the plan that shaped Providence, Rhode Island today with developer Buff Chace and urban designer planner Andres Duany, and moderated by myself, Rob Steuteville. So share your thoughts on hashtag On the Park Bench, www.tinyurl.com/OTPB And we just got back from Providence, CNU 33, which was fabulously successful. But I just wanted to remind people that we're going to have another one next year. CNU 34 is going to be in Northwest Arkansas in the late spring of 2026. This is the first time CNU will go to a region with smaller towns and cities and no main central city. But I think it's going to be great. Go to cnu.org/CNU34 to find out more. And today we've got very interesting speakers. Buff Chace is the founder and managing partner of Cornish Associates. He is a real estate developer, preservationist, conservationist, and community activist whose vision helped to spur the renaissance of downtown Providence over the last 30-some years. He is currently the developer and manager of 12 unique, treasured historic buildings that make up the Westminster Street Lofts in Providence. Buff is also a pioneer in suburban retrofit with the Mashpee Commons on Cape Cod, the Mashpee Commons project. And Buff's longtime planning partner in these endeavors is Andres Duany of DPZ Co-Design, a leading firm of new urbanism. Duany is one of the founders of the Congress for the New Urbanism, and so is his wife and design partner, Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk. Duany is an internationally known and influential urban designer and author, and I don't need to say anything more about that. I'm Rob Steuteville, editor of CNU's Public Square, and so welcome Buff and Andreas to On the Park Bench today. First, I'm going to introduce the Downcity Plan and have a discussion with Andreas and Buff. Then I'll open it up to the Q&A from the audience. So please use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions as they occur to you. And now we are going to try, well, actually, let me speak a little bit first. I wanted to say that I had friends in Providence in the 1980s. They lived in College Hill, the neighborhood to the east of downtown with Brown and Risdy. And the architecture, I thought, was beautiful at the time. And we went downtown at night, and I just remember it being very gritty. But I have another memory from Providence in the early 1990s, probably 1993 or 94. I was working for a magazine and just passing through, and I walked through a few blocks of downtown in the early evening. The buildings looked intact and solid, made of brick and stone, but they were empty, and the streets were empty. I had never seen a city so empty and so intact, and I've never seen anything quite like that since. It was like a city without people. Also in the mid-90s, I read Peter Katz's book, The New Urbanism, and it featured the Downcity Plan. I was impressed with the beautiful renderings by Charles Barrett and the plan by DPZ, and I became active in the new urbanism and came back to Providence for CNU 14 in 2006. And by that time, lo and behold, Providence was coming back to life. Now the transformation is complete. We were just there last week, and the Downcity Plan won a charter award this year from CNU. And so we're going to try to show a video that kind of gives that history of the Downcity Plan. So if, Noel, you could try showing that.
It's in the middle of the
Can you
image.
see it, Rob?
Yeah, there,
Okay,
right,
great.
right there.
I can see it, but it's not playing. Yeah, there you go. It's no sound.
Volume. No volume.
Are you in mute? You're in mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry, guys, let's start that one more time.
Providence in the mid-80s just took the wind out of my sails.
Empty streets, empty buildings. Most of the buildings were boarded up.
You would drive through in the day and think, well, I don't want to go there.
Desolate.
Nobody thought of it as a neighborhood that you would live in.
Saturday was my time to be with the kids. I had read in the newspaper that morning that the entire block was all coming up for auction. We came down and parked nearby the city hall, and then I was looking up at the beautiful buildings. They were in poor shape, but you could tell how magnificent they had been. And my daughter said, well, why don't you do something about it?
And there's this guy that starts coming around named Buff Chace.
Buff Chace brought Andres Duany into Providence.
World-renowned architect and urban planner.
Our method, which is called a charrette, is to bring the office to the place and to the presence of those who decide.
We invited the community in to give their thoughts about what to do with these buildings.
Created this massive charrette that was really very inclusive.
Designers or architects would sketch out the ideas that the individuals had.
You were there, you were invited.
Whoa, well, that might work. Then one other designer comes over and says, well, what about if you do it that way?
It was a very active, participatory kind of exercise.
Andres brought that spark.
He reminded us how fantastic Providence is.
Created buy-in from universities and colleges in the city.
I think for the first time, the whole community began to think about what downtown could become.
So we raised the enthusiasm and consciousness, and then a lot of people got to work.
Second charrette was in '94 that established the housing as the primary use.
We created the Downcity Implementation Plan,
Established the Rhode Island State Historic Tax Credit.
rewrite the zoning, mitigate state law change for the artist tax credit.
The potential that creative motors have to change place is enormous.
It's about creating rich, fertile, supportive environments. It's like when you compost in the corner of a yard and a tomato plant grows and you didn't plant it.
Cornish has just done incredible signature projects on Westminster Street.
I realized that we were going to kind of have to do it ourselves. Let's take one block of Westminster Street, taking all the old uses out of the interiors of the buildings, rebuilding them in the inside, dealing with the historic infrastructure on the facades.
We have seen in this downtown an unparalleled amount of preservation and restoration.
Just between you and me, we had no idea how to do it. We just had to try things.
The moment that I knew downtown was changing was when the strip club turned into a barbecue joint.
This can be a neighborhood.
People living and working.
The coffee house, going to the bar.
It's a bookstore, it's a restaurant.
Now we have a grocery store.
The thing about new urbanism, it's not about the individual building, it's about the buildings together and the environment that's created.
Buff Chace and Cornish believed in this downtown. This is the future of urban living.
Who are the next leaders? It's a movement that needs to continue.
Thank you, Noel.
Thank you very much, Noel, and that was inspiring. I thought it touching, Buff, that your daughter asked you to do something about the city like you were a superhero. Uh, how old was she at the time?
She was 7.
She was 7, and then you went ahead and did it. Did she remember? Did she remember that? And what does that mean to you?
Well, obviously it touched a chord. It still does when I recall that time. My aunt had been part of the founding of the Preservation Society in the 50s, along the Benefit Street corridor that was going to be a part of an urban renewal project. So I had somehow grown up with the idea that preserving the historic structures was an important part of the city, and she did that. She did 59 houses along Benefit Street with others and started the Preservation Society. So in some ways, it was in my gene pool, and when Sarah said, "Well, why don't you do something about it, Dad?" I thought, well, maybe I can't. Maybe I understand the impact of it well enough, because the Benefit Street neighborhood that had been um, preserved by my aunt and others, it had become the poster of Providence. So when people saw Providence, they saw a shot of that street. And it must have made the connection about, allow for this next generation, the Westminster Street corridor. And then I found out later, after she passed away, that she had said, yes, Westminster Street is the next most important street in Providence. So it was just, that was the story. That's the story behind it. It was the old shopping street. It was the main center for not only Rhode Island, but also the surrounding Massachusetts areas. It was where the department stores, it was where people came to, I meet you under the Shepherd's clock, which is the clock outside of Shepherd's department store. But as you pointed out, Rob, it had all been depopulated by the suburban malls. But because of the strong preservation society, the buildings were more or less intact. And so that gave us the opportunity.
How was it that you teamed up with Andres on this?
Well, you mentioned earlier the work we'd done on Mashpee Commons. Because I was an only child, I became responsible for what was a strip shopping center on the Cape. That was like a community center in the town of Mashpee, where my family had done a residential development. And so all of a sudden, I was a filmmaker at the time, and I had the responsibility of carrying on these efforts. But I was also very much anti-development on the Cape, because I thought the development in the 70s and 80s was changing the character of the place. And so I thought to myself, well, why do people come to the Cape? And they come because obviously the water, the beaches, all that, but they also come for the historic Cape Cod towns and the fabric of those towns. And so I just happened to pick up a copy of, I don't know, it was Architectural Digest or Progressive Architecture or something. And the article on the cover was Seaside in Panhandle of Florida. And Andres and his wife, Duany Seiberg, had done the plan for Seaside. I read the article. I got a hold of their telephone number. I called them, and I went down, and they taught me what they had learned. And we in 1984 through 86 had done a plan for Mashpee Commons that showed a mixed, obviously on a commercially zoned land, which is, to try and do a mixed use town center that was, in the nature, excuse me, in the with the same bloodlines as the historic Cape Town, and that's turned into a big success, although we're still having difficulty building housing as part of it. But anyway, so I met Andres and Liz and did another project in Florida with Liz that was also turned down because of this whole thing of mixture of uses or small houses that was antithetical to what people were doing then. But anyway, that was just the fortuitous nature of this, that I picked up this magazine and there they were. So that was how we connected.
I don't know if I ever told you, but I was living in Mashpee at the time when you owned that shopping center. But
Oh no, you didn't.
Mashpee was beautiful, but it had no center. It had no there, really no, urban village.
Right.
So Andres, tell me, like, what are your recollections of starting to work with Buff?
Well, he came to the office with Doug Soares, his intellectual partner, who in fact was a landscape architect, very skillful. And he must get some credit because almost all the ideas were already beginning to ferment. We were just a little further ahead. I think we have to remember that the success of Seaside is because the world was ready for it. It was just beginning to get sick and tired of suburban sprawl. And so things were begun, and what we had was the credibility to move things forward. Not so much the technical knowledge, but the credibility. I was going to mention one thing about Buff, and Buff's, I'm so glad you mentioned his aunt. But the cities that have collapsed, the American cities that have collapsed, did not so much die as they were murdered. And I knew that. That's one thing that I could say. This is a very viable genetic material, but it's been killed. And one of the things that killed it was not only the Robert Moses highways that were being brought in to just ream out some of the best neighborhoods in Providence, but there were also bad projects. We were not the first to attempt the revival. We weren't the first. And I think what's different about the new urbanism is not that we're the first, we're just the first ones without bad ideas. Because, for example, the Providence River was covered. It had been concreted over, which would seem incredible to just put a parking lot over the river with just a little gap in between both sides. And that had already been dug out. That horrible idea had been dug out already. There was an IMP plan that cut off all the streets on one end of the downtown and put a kind of platform, taking the Catholic Cathedral and basically pedestrianizing the whole area, which of course killed it instantly. Westminster Street itself was pedestrianized, which probably killed it instantly. And this is beyond the people moving to the suburbs. We give a lot of blame to the people moving out to the suburbs, the shopping centers, and the housing subdivisions. But I think we also have to give some blame to the really bad ideas of post-war urban revival. We were different from them, and that made all the difference. So there was already some velocity. It was Buff, but already some terrible things had been removed and some good ones were beginning. What I did call out to them is not that Providence doesn't do things. It does do things. In fact, almost every plan that we could find in the historical archives, believe it or not, had been implemented. These guys are implementers, but the plans were so ill-conceived that they just made the matters worse. And I think what we did is to remind the people in Providence that they were implementers. They had gotten things done. And this time it was different. But of course, it was more difficult this time because they had been burned before. That's something we've all learned, is that planners used to have a very bad reputation with their bad ideas. And that's exactly the historical moment that we entered, in which people were willing to try again. Buff's generation was willing to try again.
What were the elements that made the Downcity plan different from other plans that were being done at the time, you think?
If I may answer that, we've done others, but there were number one is a role that when you find it is necessary, and that's the role that Buff played. Buff was a developer, of course, and he invested heavily in it, but he was also the leader that brought together, that made things happen. The artists were heavily supported. Anybody who had a cool idea, for a bar or a nightclub or anything, he would support that. And but you have to have someone like Buff, I've come to realize, because during the time since the charrette, there have been 5 mayors and potentially 10, depending how you count, there have been 10 city councils. And one of the problems we have is that there's no continuity in government. And so I think a role has to be created and considered in the new urbanism, which is someone that is played by, a role that's played by Buff or Boo Thomas, for example, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Somebody that sticks it out for 30 years, right across the political changes. If you hitch your plan to a political situation, it doesn't last very long because it's continually a political football. Mayors are in and out. And so that's one lesson that I've learned. We need someone, a kind of ombudsman that lasts for 20 or 30 years.
Well, maybe you can talk about that a little bit, Buff. I mean, you were a champion of this project and you also had the ability to get things done, but you've stuck with it for an entire generation.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I'll comment on the early days of it. It was we were working under the mayor, Buddy Cianci, who was a famous character and had been mayor for 20 some years. And he took a liking to Andres, and they would give each other, kind of quips back and forth. And Andres, and he was very fond of, as an Italian, by his heritage, was very fond of Florence, Italy, and so and to the point where he made Florence a sister city, or they had a sister city arrangement with Providence. So Andres's knowledge of classical urbanism and all that kind of stuff was really played well. He was impressed, and but what was my point?
But may I just mention the quotation that he loved that really turned him around? I
Yeah.
said, it was this. It says, Florence is not loved because she is beautiful. Florence is beautiful because she is loved.
Right.
You see? And he just loved that. He kept repeating it, and I know that he loved Providence, and he could see that he could be proactive and not just political.
That's a wonderful, thank you for remembering that, Andres. But anyway, what I was saying is that I was really not part of the business community in Providence, and actually had been a anti-war person in the 70s, 60s, and 70s. So I was not part of establishment by any means, but but what I did know, I knew enough people that were in that establishment, the corporate group. We had probably 10 or 12 corporate headquarters down here at that time. And then we were a university town as well as a state capital. So the heads of the universities played a role. And we established a 501c3 called Coalition for Community Development, which was selling Andres's ideas that, hey, we can do this if we do it together and not just rely on Buddy, the mayor or whatever, because it was to try and separate it from just a totally political game where actually the big taxpayers, the influential business owners, and that was very successful. They raised money for a 5-year study of it. They paid my firm to to actually move the ideas forward. I mentioned earlier that one of the things we found we needed in terms of what's today called the capital stack was state historic tax credit and on top of the federal historic tax credit. And so it took a couple of years to go to the states that had state historic tax credits and get their statutes and then get it passed through the legislature. So there was a lot of kind of small steps that were required to make the numbers work. And then after 5 years, we hadn't made a lot of progress. And I said, well, we're going to have to start. It's wonderful for you, gentlemen, and ladies to have supported this, but we're really going to have to prove to it, because the economic equation doesn't really still work to attract private capital. And we're going to have, my suggestion is that we take one block and just do it the way it could be. So to show, how dynamic taking this historic urban fabric and making it into being useful. And but I couldn't get any takers on that. They didn't want to make that next commitment. And so I found a co-developer in Boston who had done artist lofts in the downtown, and he joined me, a guy named Bob Keene, who was pivotal in terms of us teaching. We learned from him as how he had taken commercial buildings in downtown Boston and switched them to lofts. Anyway, so we ended up doing that one block, and then we have attracted some other. Oh, then the corporations died, or they were during the 90s and early 2000s. The corporations, many of them banks, were purchased by larger banks, and so the corporate offices were no longer in Providence. So actually, I kept appealing to my family to be supportive of this, and have done that. We've attracted a couple of outside Providence developers to try it, but it's not a great, I mean, at least at this point, you have to look at it from a long-term perspective. There has to be more than just a financial return. And so one of the things now, of course, as I'm approaching the end of my career, is to find high net worth individuals that could get this kind of double return, which is the civic, in addition to a financial return that could be modest, is also the civic return for doing something in the city that you live in, that your children go to school in, et cetera, that will make the place better. And so that's what we're trying to discuss now abroad the town, and the idea that the CNU was just here, and then it was the second time that they came back to Providence. All this was giving people a lot of excitement about, we really are worth saving. Now what I have to do is go out and try and put together some partnerships along with not-for-profits, the community foundation, et cetera. These are my goals. I have not done that yet, but it's like, and also to find people beyond me, so that it's not reliant on me. I'm
Well,
sorry.
I was going to say, you bring up something that's really important, and it struck me. Most cities have small and medium buildings. For example, the Hill, on the east side, are houses. They may be big houses, they may be townhouses, but it's actually a small increment of development. The problem with a core city, and Providence is a core, it's not just a city, it's a core. Every single building is large, and every single building is a major investment. That's why Buff has to, keep saying that he's always looking for major players. Most cities that we work with, in other places, Naples and West Palm Beach, et cetera. The buildings are smaller, and you can get a lot of small developers to be active. Providence is different. It's a big town with big department stores. It's got high rises that have to be purchased as a whole, you know, and that's what has made it difficult. I think that if it were a smaller scale city, it would be finished and gentrifying. So that would be our next problem. But the problem is that the buildings are very large, right, Buff? You need, you know, the skyscrapers are the next buildings. It's a big place.
Yeah, like in the for those of you, I don't know, is this just on? Can people see us as well as hear us, Rob?
Yeah. Yes.
So anyone that can see me, this is me, in the back of my window
But you have to move your head. You have to move your head. Okay.
Is the Superman building. And it's called the Superman building because it was looks like the Daily Planet building when Clark Kent used to jump off it as Superman. And it was actually it's not where the film was done. That was the Los Angeles City Hall, but it's the same architect. And that was the Industrial Trust building for many years until about 10 years ago, when it was no longer used. The bank that was in it, the Fleet Bank, was acquired by Bank of America, so it's remained vacant. And but the owner is trying to get 300 units of housing in there, which, you know, about 1.5, 1.7 people per unit of housing, would add another 500 people downtown, which would be significant in terms of assuring the next step for downtown. So you can see the other buildings there.
Let me talk a little bit about Superman. Okay, Buff.
Yeah.
One of the things that is remarkable about, Buff is speaking of the difficulties he has, but it's also an extraordinary place. The first thing, I mean, and it's a lucky place. First of all, the downtown, the core, does not have a burnt out ring before it gets to the east side, which is very beautiful and high end. You know, most cities have a pretty good core, but then there's a burnt out series. There's a donut of burnt out neighborhoods that you have to bridge. Providence isn't like that. That's incredible to find a place like that. Second, it has 3 universities right downtown, you know, RISD, Johnson and Wales, and Brown. That is a great privilege. It also has a rail line that connects in a fast train from Boston to New York. And one of the things they did, and this is what I mean by Superman, they took the tracks out from the downtown and moved them away from the downtown to liberate a lot of real estate. They did exactly the same thing with a highway, an elevated highway to the south and a power plant. They took down that highway, you know, I don't know, a 6-laner elevated, took it down and moved it away from the downtown. There are many very large, they built a conference center. They built an excellent quality shopping mall, which is 2-sided. It faces the highway as a conventional mall, but it engages the street as a conventional one. And there's so much that is really lucky and really large that Providence has done. And I could mention over and over again, I was always shocked when I came about how much they got done in my 5-10 year absences, sometimes jumps. And they somehow hadn't noticed that they had gotten so much done. And they constantly, this is something we have to remember with cities. Cities need to be reminded that as they improve, that they have improved, because often the record, it's not like new towns, you know, in which everything is new and everything's an achievement. People don't know how much has been done unless they're reminded. And that's a phenomena that I learned in Providence. And Buff did a couple of books, very good quality books. One is portraits of all the people who had helped over the last 25 years. You know, very nice, beautiful portraits of all the people, big and small, that have worked. And also another book on the projects an album of the projects, which is just astonishing. So, including, by the way, a new airport, all and with a rail line connecting it. I mean, these things that any other city would not stop bragging about, somehow Providence is very modest about. And I think more bragging would be justified, Buff, in terms of bringing developers.
I wanted to
Rob, can I just mention one thing? Andres was talking about the merchants. I can't remember, we have 52 first floor merchants, or 50, something like that, and we made a decision after my experience at Mashpee Commons to just go with independent merchants on the first floor. So we have no national tenants. And so the stores are, and we spend quite a lot of time curating those folks, those restaurants and stores, et cetera. So I think to differentiate that piece of the puzzle is an important thing to the degree possible. Sorry, Rob.
I wanted to remind people to use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask questions. We will get to those shortly, but I wanted to ask about collaboration and partnerships. One piece that I don't really understand is, Downcity Plan was sponsored, I guess, by the city and also Johnson and Wales University. Buff, you knew Andres and Liz. And that they were the right people to come in and bring into plan. But how did you get all these other people on board as the sponsors and the leaders of this plan to bring them in?
Well, I don't really remember, to be honest with you. I think just one of the kind things that just happened to me in this last Congress was I was presented with an award that was titled the Sisyphus Award, which those of you that know Sisyphus, he was the guy that pushes the boulder up the hill, and so it was just, I got the bug that this was a thing that was a good thing to do with my time and energy, and I just kept going for it, and then a lot of other people joined, a lot of people that that also lived here. I was able to work with them to keep some forward momentum, even during the difficult times.
Yeah,
my son. Sorry.
I would like to emphasize that if you spent a day with Buff, any one of the many times I visited him, and you set off for breakfast in the morning and were there till 10 o'clock at night, you would see the variety of things that an urban developer has to do. From incredibly heavy-duty meetings with lawyers, to just being friendly with homeless people, to being with artists and cajoling them, to come in and bring their friends. I mean, the variety of things that Buff did in a day, just moving that boulder upwards, is astonishing. Okay, you can't do this with a spreadsheet, and you can't stay in your office. It has to be, you have to be a sidewalk person, constantly in motion every day. And that's what I learned from Buff, is that developers, from morning to night, have to be generalists about everything, and they have to work very hard all day. I find that that's not understood well enough now. I think that there are too many people that are just spreadsheet jockeys. And when you talk to them about going out and speaking to somebody and convincing them, they think it's beneath them. They stay at their desk with the spreadsheet. That just doesn't work. Doesn't work. It has to be a person that's engaged, in life all day and all night. And that's what I witnessed with Buff for 3 decades.
Let me ask you something that really struck me about the Downcity Plan, and I think it struck me right when I read about it in Peter Katz's book in 1994, and that is like the focus on the public realm, that everything was focused on creating a streetscape and public space in the downtown. And that seemed to me completely much different, like a new urbanist approach, but it seemed much different from any other plan I'd ever seen.
One thing, may I just say one thing? If you look at the plan, I was looking at it today when you were cycling through the images at the beginning. We instead of fixing everything everywhere, that plan actually focused the activity to complete, like Buff said, first you complete a block. Actually, first you complete a block face, the two buildings facing each other. Then you extend it up the street another block, then another block. Then you pay attention to the next street over. You don't do everything everywhere. You know, what our plan did is it focused on the critical elements, right? Obviously, every plan does that. But we also, and Buff led us to this can be done first. This is what's available to do it next. So for example, there was Westminster Street, but then there was also Johnson and Wales, who decided, this university decided was about to move out of the city to a suburban campus, and they remained behind and made the investment downtown and built an entire Georgian campus downtown, and they revived the next street over. You see what I'm saying? There's too much. I find more that the attempt to save everything simultaneously saves nothing, because you don't have that, 5-minute walk of continual urban public space that you mentioned. The public spaces have to be in one place. They can't be scattered all over the city, because they don't coalesce. That's in the plan that you saw. You'll see that there are dark streets and light gray streets and white streets. In the plan, the black streets have to go first, and then the gray streets may be next, and then forget about the white streets. They're hopeless. And our theory has always been that actually in American cities, about a third of the streets have absolutely no future. They're hopeless to begin with. They can't be restored to any level of excellence. But so you begin with the best ones, the easier ones to make great.
I'm going to get to some questions from the attendees. Were there conversations about gentrification in Providence, and how have those questions been addressed over the years?
Well, I think gentrification is a difficult word. It's like affordable these days. It means different things to different people. So it's hard to get in. Of course, there was criticism that there was gentrification because buildings that had housed artist lofts, in a few of their areas were now converted to, to modern standards and to many more units of housing. So the artists had to move. Fortunately, we had an artist community downtown that coalesced around an organization called AS220. In the video that we looked at earlier, the founder of that, Bert Krenke, and they started to build artist housing. They have 47 units of artist housing. And we're working with a not-for-profit developer now to develop another big chunk of artist housing. So yes, gentrification means moving some people into other places because the bigger need is there. That's true, but I think we want the artist community, we want the culture that they bring to be downtown. We got a sales tax exemption for the district for the sale of art to help encourage the sale of art down here. So, right now, what we're experiencing a different kind of gentrification in Providence, which I think many cities are, because we're not building enough housing. There's an in-migration into Providence now. It's one of the top 5 in the country, and so it's making rents go up dramatically. And so the neighborhoods, we have 24 neighborhoods. rents in those neighborhoods are going up just by the crisis of lack of housing. So that's a different form of gentrification, which is more really, you know.
I think we need to, the new urbanists is to engage that. Some years ago, and about 10 years ago in the CNU, there was this very, very important woman called Carol Coletta, who gave a big lecture at the CNU, and she said something that was stunning to me. She says, 5% of the American cities have a gentrification problem. 95% need nothing more than gentrification. Okay, when we began in Providence, the biggest population downtown and the biggest was a homeless shelter, a very large homeless shelter. So when you begin with homeless all over the street, you basically bring a kind of, you know, middle class first, and then it becomes viable for-profit development. Buff has just said, it's not profitable yet to develop in Providence. It's expensive to revitalize buildings to historic standards, these fine old buildings. And so this idea that the new urbanism is going to call out gentrification, yes, do that in the cities that actually are gentrifying, but some cities are just trying to get a tax base, you know, well before they become gentrified. Okay, and most of the cities we work with are empty, and they need people to come in to pay the taxes. So let's think about the city that we're speaking of before we just pull out the gentrification problem.
I assume in 1992, it maybe wasn't even on the horizon, the idea of gentrification. Is that correct, or were people already talking about it in 19?
It wasn't on the horizon, yeah.
But you know, Rob, the first time I heard it, which I don't know was in the mid-90s, I had been spending my entire career for 15 years at the time trying to bring the gentry into cities, just to get a tax base, to get somebody that could pay rent, you know, and then it emerged very slowly. And now it's the default critique of the new urbanism. You guys gentrify everything. But I think we need to assess before we accuse anybody of gentrifying. We need to find out what state, you know, in the hockey puck, where in the hockey puck is that city before we accuse it of gentrifying.
Somebody asked, and maybe a quick answer, but how did Providence manage to have a railway moved, which is really quite astonishing?
Good question. I think Rhode Island benefits from having two senators.
You might meet them on the street.
Right, exactly. And so from time to time we box above our weight, and also the highway that Andres talked about, we moved to the south. It was in bad shape and it needed to be rebuilt, but rather than rebuild it in the place that it was, we were able to move it to the south. So the same thing happened with the railway to the north. It allowed the downtown to grow, so over time it was the right move. Yeah.
And you know, Buff, also, you know, looking at it from the outside, the fact that it's the state capital, I've also worked in Baton Rouge. What it does is it keeps an airport operating, you know, which is very important for industry. Like, you know, Providence, which is a small city, nevertheless has an airport that, as they say, you know, is above its weight. And so state capitals are especially a privilege, I think, in their prospects for big work like that.
We have a question about sea level rise, and one of the big things in Providence history, living memory of some people, I suppose, is the hurricane of 1938. Was that correct? And the flooding of the downtown then. And so it's a reminder that Providence is a seaport city. We have a question that what have been the sea level rise mitigation efforts underway in Providence as growth and redevelopment expands downtown and other places around downtown?
Well, We started a 501c3 called PRP, Providence Resilience Partners, basically with a similar idea as the original Downcity stuff, 30 years later or whatever it is, 40 years later, to deal with these and to try and coordinate the defenses against sea level rise. Actually, it's not just sea level rise, it's climate change too, because we also, the whole riverine system that is in southeastern Mass and other places drain down through Providence. So we're probably more vulnerable to flooding from the rivers than the hurricane. After the hurricane in 54, which was actually just as bad, if not worse, than the 38, we built a hurricane barrier so that the actual storm probably is, we're protected by the city itself. And that was done through a bond after the Hurricane Carol in 54. But obviously it's a low-lying city. The riverine system is, so people are just working together, and the PRP is coordinating. They were part of the Congress that we just had. Michelle Jalbert is leading it, and we're doing something called a climate vulnerability analysis that we are receiving funding for from the federal government. We're holding our breath. But anyway, yeah, we're very aware of it. Good question.
Here's a question that's sort of a perpetual question of new urbanists. And when you brought in Andreas and Liz, you had to deal with this because nobody had ever heard of new urbanism. But how can emerging planners get others to buy into new urbanist principles and best practices in less progressive environment?
Look, the new urbanism, Chris Alexander told me 3 decades ago, he said, we all know what the appliance is. What we need to do is to design the plugs that connect it to the existing power grids in the popular. The appliance, which is the new urbanism, which is the walkable city with spatial definition, diverse in every way, etc. That appliance is ancient, and we've actually developed the techniques. The problem we're having with the new urbanism is that we keep circling around, we keep nudging the techniques and not working on the plugs that connect with the different power grids. If we realize, for example, that Trump is in charge for 3 years now, 3.5 years, and he has a very clear power grid of where he's going to spend the money, what he's going to do, right? I mean, we have 3.5 years that I personally can't waste. My thought is not to alter what the new urbanism does, but to design the power grids that connect to his ideology or to his prospects. I have read some of the executive orders that he has given. He is very pro-developer, and he is very anti-bureaucracy, right? And whenever I say we must ride this anti-bureaucracy ideology, it's good for us and the small developer city needs. People in the new urbanism turn around and say, how can you even talk to Trump? I said, I'm not altering the technology and the ideals of the new urbanism. I'm just plugging it to the president we happen to have for 3.5 years. You see what I'm saying? And I think we should be designing plugs that work wherever we are, because the red states will continue to exist beyond Trump, and so will the blue states. We still speak about the new urbanism in all of them, but we speak differently. We don't trip up by saying we hate cars, or we hate single-family houses, or everybody has to be on transit. You don't do that in a red state, right? Just don't bring that up. Bring up the sense of community, bring up the small developer, right? The red states love the idea of the small developer, of empowering many small developers. They'll hook on to that. And I think we need to do a study of how do we, if the nation is going to be split in red and blue for the foreseeable future, we are much too blue in our presentations, and we need to develop some red presentations without tampering with the basic principles of the charter.
Rob?
Yes, Buff.
I'm just seeing, I mean, you're the boss here, but I'm just seeing on the chat here, people talking about how do you attract funding for these redevelopment projects, which is a hugely good question. So at some point we should address that, I think.
Well, why don't you address it now?
Well, I mean, I guess that's my question too. I have the same question. I think we, you know, I don't want to characterize where we've been in terms of finance bros, et cetera, and the focus on money and returns and stuff like that. But I think this idea, which I haven't been able to resolve, of people getting satisfaction from redeveloping the town that they live in, and not requiring large returns in the early years. You know, whether it's instead of a 5-year window, you're looking at a 10 to 20-year window, and not just requiring returns that allow the banks to be happy that the debt service is covered and not looking for your own return. And how do you find people in your community that might be willing to put together a fund to do that? And could it be led or participated in by the local community foundation? I mean, I think these are questions that we don't know the answer to yet, but I think that that's really the next step. You know, every town is different, every region is different. Where the capital may exist that needs to be approached and partnered with to create these redevelopment opportunities. And of course, you know, there are parts of the country where there are funding for housing that comes from government and stuff, but I think we have to realize that we are not going to be able to rely on funding from government sources to be as evident as it has been. So it's the big question, I think, is John Coker asked that question, and some other folks have as well. It's something we should make a part of the new urbanist dialogue.
Well, there's funding for the public realm, and there's funding for housing and buildings, and these are like two different things. Is Providence a model for any other cities around the country in terms of you know, financing and getting stuff built?
Well, I'm not sure. No, because it was mostly done by a handful of people, a small handful. And now, to the degree it's been a success, in theory, that could attract more people, but it's just not a habit. And you know, whereas you think about 19th century and various other earlier times of the 20th century, that probably was. You know, now people are investing, I don't know what, in their university or something like that, but it's got to sort of become cool to invest in your town, and not looking. I wouldn't put your money there that you're going to rely on for annual returns, but over time, a generation or something, it will make sense. And we just need to, I think, honor people that might consider doing that.
Andres, do you think that Providence is a model for other cities? You've worked in hundreds of cities.
No, I don't. No, I haven't worked in hundreds of cities. I've probably worked in 10, some successfully, some others. The problem is right now, my biggest problem is the short cycle of elections. Like, for example, I'm working in Vero Beach, and they have elections for the city council every two years. People are continually running for office. There's nobody that you convince that it's in office by the time a vote has to be taken. By the time the vote, you present the plan, you speak to the elected officials during the charrette, and most of them are not there 2 years. 2 years later, there has to be. This is my new thing. There has to be a longer political cycle. There has to be somebody like Buff, not necessarily as quite as thoroughly as an investor, and not quite somebody who dedicates their life to it, but there needs to be somebody like Haussmann, Baron Haussmann in Paris, who's in action for 25 years, and not just subject to whoever, wherever the Paris Council gets elected in Iraq. He was the emperor protected him from politics. He was a pure technician. His only job was to avoid the next revolution. And that kind of thing we need that profession. Unfortunately, we suspect anybody with that kind of power, thanks to Robert Moses. But I think things are moving too quickly now for the Jane Jacobs, small nudges of the world. And yes, that's what I've learned. What I would say is try to set up a committee that is a permanent standing committee protected from the politics. And that will help quite a lot.
Well, we are now just past the hour, and I will say that we will post this video on the CNU website, and people can go and watch it then. And I don't know if Buff, you have any last thoughts on this? Where's Providence heading?
Of course, I'm an optimist, or I wouldn't be doing this Sisyphus Award or not. But I think that obviously the next generation of people to take on these kinds of tasks is what I'm searching for, and giving them confidence that you actually can make change. We just have to redefine what success is and what returns are, and how important our own communities are. And we have to kind of dig deep. Right after our family, our communities are the next most important thing. So God bless everyone for trying to figure this out. I think this is really a dialogue that we'll be having over the next few years within the new urbanism. Thanks, Rob, for organizing this.
Well, thank you, Buff. Thank you, Andres. It's been a great conversation, and thanks for everybody who attended. And I guess we'll sign off now.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Great job.